We see Ben and Rook as they were out running, and Rook questions why they are not out doing their jobs, to which Ben responds that they are. Undertown had gotten bigger since the last time Ben had been there, and they needed to learn to navigate the altered area if they were to be proficient in catching the bad guys, and Rook needed to learn the lay of the land. Ben then asked if he's ever heard of parkour, and then jumped onto a wall, then off of it onto a roof before he could answer, and begins running rooftops with Rook doing the same to follow him. As they continue running the rooftops and jumps off of things, and Ben jumps off, landing onto the ground before heading into a tunnel. Rook then followed him there, as this was a rather interesting way to do patrols for Undertown, and continued making their way until they'd stopped in the middle of the marketplace. We see a large man in a skeleton armor walking in the tunnel again, before saying to hunt them down as the red flash appeared again. They walk past a vendor selling tentacles on a stick, and Ben buys one from them as they continue walking while he was eating it. Rook asks should they not be trying to find the leader of the alien protection racket, and Ben tells him those guys would find him, while tossing away the stick now that it was done. They hear something about protozoan smoothies, and Ben says that he hasn't had one in about 5 years, but before they could order, a Vulpamancer starts rampaging, and he sighs an annoyance about what was happening. He says first Stinkfly, now Wildmutt, seriously while activating the Omnitrix. Ben changes into Crash Hopper, ready for another round, as the Vulpamancer charges at him and then barely dodges and kicks him in the gills on the side of his neck, making them fly over down an alleyway, just barely missing the stance in the process, and our hero tells his junior partner that they need to go after them, before jumping down the alleyway with Rook following him. They chase down the Vulpamancer using the rooftops to avoid having to go around people in trash bins, as the target had gone down the wrong path and reached a dead end. The two then jumped down, and Rook called out that they should surrender immediately, as the large man says that 2 against 1 isn't a sporting chance, as a canister releasing smoke dropped down into the alleyway, filling it, and when it cleared, the target was gone. Rook says that was strange, and Ben says that they need answers and leads him somewhere, telling him to come on. Rook questions where they were going, and Ben just tells them to have a filtration mask ready when they get there. We then see a sign reading Gas House on it, as someone walked out to where they were standing, telling the two of them to use the service entrance. Ben and Rook both put on filtration masks and walked inside. Well, Rook tried to kick the door, but Ben told him not to show his badge or draw attention here as the red spot. Reverting to human, Ben walked inside with Rook, as there were different aliens there, some that he knew, some that he didn't. Ben had told Rook to just stand by and observe while they're inside the tank, to which he'd nodded, ready to learn from the master. An alien Soterogian began to yell at Ben in a language Rook didn't understand, though it seemed to him that they were clearly angry at him for something. He'd assumed they were possibly threatening him and began to reach for his tool, but Ben put his hand out to stop him, telling him it's okay. This is his friend 99, and Rook apologized to them with the angry tone he had thought they were an enemy. Ben explains that she's mad that he didn't make it to her first childbirth ceremony, though he was, kind of busy fighting off an interdimensional god and their forces at the time. But he does still apologize for not being able to make it. After a moment, 99 lets out a sigh, then began speaking again while turning her head and making gestures. We see a little Soterogian waddling their way over, in armor that looked like it had 2 pigtails and a ballerina tutu around their waist, as they hid partially behind 99, looking at Ben and Rook, as the older alien then says something, and Ben says that Gwen would love to have met her, then hands them both a card and patted the little one on the head. 99 speaks to Ben, and he says that's what they're after actually. It'd be a serious help if they would, and she nodded, continuing to speak in their language before heading off with the little one, leaving Rook confused. Ben says that they'll explain on the way as he takes the lead, and they leave the joint together to head off to where they were told they might be located. As they are making their way in, Rook questions what that was about, and Ben just says that the small one was 99's daughter, 1010, who was 2 years old. 99 often had a lot of information, and she was able to tell them where to find the guys that were in charge of the shakedowns. As they walk through the tunnel entrance, and all the aliens there pointed blasters at them. They found out Siphon was in charge of these guys and started fighting, with Ben hitting the Omnitrix and changing into Walkatrout, leaving him confused about how he was supposed to handle this, but he then got an idea after looking around. He got down on his stomach and told Rook to give him a push. Doing so, Ben then began bouncing around and off of the unused bombs, knocking over some of the guys. Ben calls for Rook to get to the gap and not let him get past. Keep sending him back. They nod and do so as Walkatrout basically becomes a big pinball game, knocking down the bad guys for points and using the bombs as bumpers, going faster and faster still. Siphon tries to stop them, firing blaster shots at Ben, missing because of their speed and hitting their goons instead. Each goon that was hit was rendered out cold and used as a bumper by Walkatrout until only Siphon was left, and Ben calls out to Rook that he needed a ramp. Get him airborne. And Rook picked up a large flat sheet of metal as Ben was headed his way, and slid up it, sliding up the wall, around the curved roof, and down the other side as the windowsill acted as a sort of eject ramp, slamming him into Siphon's back and knocking him over the railing and onto the ground. Moving quickly, Rook had run over and put cuffs on the downed criminals, and then did so for Siphon as well, before he could react, keeping him from getting away. He then starts to read all of them their rights, as was Plumber Code, and called into the base to let them know that they had a criminal ring ready for transport. Ben tells Rook that he did a good job today and tells him that learning to think on your feet and adapt to a situation, even when the tools you are given seem useless, and overcoming the odds, are a part of what makes a good plumber great. Walkatrout is one example of that. Most would just see a way to escape and not much else, whereas he sees a capable fighter with only a little push.